I now give the floor to the representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and the member states.
Thank you, Chair. Indeed, I have the honour to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The EU is a steadfast supporter of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which informs our approach to Indigenous issues, covering the 6 mandated areas of the Permanent Forum. 10 years ago, at the launch of the SDGs, the UN Secretary-General underlined the need to take Indigenous peoples into account across the different goals, and said that Indigenous peoples must not be left behind. Now, with only 5 years left, we know that we are not on track to meet the SDGs. In line with the Pact for the Future, we recognise that leaving no one behind requires strengthened partnerships and mobilisation of financial resources. So we look forward to the important 4th International Conference on Financing for Development in June. The EU stresses the need to be ambitious yet realistic. We need action and accountability, and we must recognise, build on and improve existing frameworks and achievements. As the central UN platform for dialogue on the 2030 agenda, the high-level political forum on sustainable development to be held in July will be key to progress. The EU is committed to strengthening multi-stakeholder engagement and will continue to engage actively in all efforts to enhance the full, effective and meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions, as well as civil society, in relevant UN bodies on issues affecting them. SDG 5 is one of those under review this year. It aims to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. The EU will promote full, effective and meaningful participation and leadership of all women, including Indigenous women. Also of particular interest, as we have just heard, is SDG 16, which seeks to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. The reports of violence and brutality against Indigenous peoples, including reprisals for taking part in this forum, demand an effective response from all member states and from the wider international community. Later, in November, the World Social Summit will present an opportunity to renew a global social contract anchored in human rights and the ILO's fundamental principles and rights at work. The EU supports broad participation at the summit, including by Indigenous peoples.
I thank the representatives for their statement. I now call upon the representative of UNESCO.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. Distinguished delegates, UNESCO is pleased to present the key findings of the work conducted on Indigenous people and the media at the request of the Permanent Forum in 2023. Building on the Forum's 2023 recommendation, UNESCO, in partnership with a wide range of partners, has examined national policies and practices, research papers, and analyzed media monitoring data, as well as held a number of consultations regarding Indigenous people and the media. This work is the result of over 2 years of extensive research, close consultations, and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, as well as a wide range of media organizations, academics, and other stakeholders, including the former Special Rapporteur, members of the expert mechanisms on the rights of Indigenous people, and the Permanent Forum. We would like to thank everyone who helped prepare this work. The study outlines 12 recommendations for future action and highlights the ongoing challenges that are important to address to pave the way for further progress. Let me summarize the key points. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and access media without discrimination, largely unfulfilled, hindering media pluralism, upholding the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 16, is crucial for their meaningful participation in society. requiring further research, stronger legal frameworks, and support for indigenous media. Indigenous representation in media is insufficient, requiring equitable editorial policies and greater inclusion of indigenous media professionals, particularly in decision-making roles. Financial support is needed for both indigenous and non-indigenous media, particularly public service and community media. Digital platforms present both opportunities and challenges. Investment in infrastructure and digital tools is key. Access to information, media content, and services in indigenous languages is essential for media preservation, while intersectional approaches addressing gender, disability, and youth participation languages, as well as the implementation of the Global Action in the case of indigenous languages. Building new partnerships between indigenous and non-indigenous media is vital for fostering collaboration and meaningful participation. The Media Partnership Forum, which was in Paris, provided an open space for constructive dialogue between indigenous and non-indigenous media, regulatory authorities, academic institutions, and UN indigenous mechanisms. Lastly, the donor community is invited to support the development of indigenous media by offering funding opportunities for indigenous media to mobilize resources.
I thank the representative for their statement. I now call upon the representative of the Asia Indigenous People Pact.
Thank you, Chair. On behalf of the Asia Caucus, we congratulate the UN Permanent Forum for this comprehensive and valuable study. However, with due respect, we would like to highlight certain limitations in its framing. Fenton's work was groundbreaking in exposing psychological and structural violence imposed by external colonial powers. However, his analysis did not account for pre-existing systems of internal colonialism, structures of domination imposed by dominant native groups that long predated external colonialism. Neocolonialism is commonly understood as the continuation of foreign economic and political influence after formal decolonization. Yet this framing is insufficient in explaining for the realities where dominant internal native groups have colonized indigenous peoples. Internal colonialism not only predates but also outlasts external colonialism. What indigenous peoples are confronting today is not merely a residual legacy, but the reconfiguration of colonial logics by dominant groups and their elites who now wield state power. Colonialism did not begin with foreign powers, nor did it end with their departure. Thailand and Nepal, for example, were never colonized by external powers. India and Ryukyu, Japan, presents a case of dual colonialism in relation to its indigenous peoples. In many parts of Asia, indigenous systems of self-governance that existed before colonialism were already facing threat from internal colonization, which were layered over and compounded by external colonialism and the legacies that followed withdrawal of foreign growth. We recommend the following. Expand the UN study to document global cases where internal colonialism predates, coincides, and survives external colonialism, offering concrete policy guidance for dismantling such structures and restoring indigenous sovereignties. Second, support indigenous peoples in rebuilding their systems of governance, recognizing them as co-sovereigns and distinct political entities. Operationalize Article 3, 26, and 36 of the UN Grid, upholding indigenous self-governance and territorial sovereignty beyond state-imposed boundaries. Promote cross-border cooperation frameworks for indigenous governance of transboundary territories. Urge states to review and reform internal administrative boundaries that divide indigenous territories, ensuring the implementation of the principle of territorial integrity of indigenous peoples within and across nation states. Integrate indigenous territorial realities in the UN systems, especially in data and peace-building development, to avoid relying on state-centric boundaries that erase indigenous.
I thank the representative for their statement. I now call upon the representative of Mexico.
Durante esta sesión del Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas. La Constitución mexicana establece que la nación tiene una composición pluricultural y multiétnica sustentada originalmente en sus pueblos indígenas. Desde Desde el inicio de sus trabajos preparatorios, México respaldó el proceso de aprobación de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas hasta lograr su aprobación. Como parte de uno de los poderes de la Unión del Estado mexicano, el Tribunal Electoral del Poder Judicial de la Federación que presido ha interpretado la declaración al dictar sentencias con perspectiva intercultural e interseccional. En nuestra jurisprudencia, que son 46 en temas indígenas, hemos establecido, entre otros criterios, que el derecho de autogobierno de pueblos y comunidades indígenas implica el reconocimiento, mantenimiento y defensa de la autonomía para elegir a sus autoridades conforme a procedimientos, normas y prácticas tradicionales, que deben realizarse consultas previas con los pueblos indígenas en relación con cualquier medida que pueda afectar sus intereses. Y se ha definido que los sistemas normativos y usos y costumbres deben promover y respetar el derecho al voto activo y pasivo de las mujeres, en apego al ODS 5. Armónicamente con este último criterio, hace un año establecimos una defensoría para asesorar, defender y representar gratuitamente a mujeres que sean presuntas víctimas de violencia política. De los 133 casos que la Defensoría ha atendido desde su creación, casi una tercera parte son de mujeres indígenas. Esto evidencia que la participación y representación política de las mujeres indígenas enfrenta grandes retos, como la reparación del daño en casos de violaciones a sus derechos fundamentales. Para enfrentarlos y encontrar soluciones adecuadas, cuentan con el compromiso de una justicia con perspectiva intercultural e interseccional. En ese camino, México y el Tribunal Electoral del Poder Judicial de la Federación seguirá juzgando por la dignidad y el respeto a todas las personas, pueblos y comunidades indígenas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement. I now call upon the representative of UNEP.
Madam Chair, esteemed member of the Permanent Forum, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, and representatives of indigenous peoples. Madam Chair and member of the Forum, UNEP deeply appreciates your leadership and commitment to environmental and sustainability issues at a time when the world is facing interconnected crises, including those stemming from climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. The sixth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly demonstrated through multilateralism with wide engagement from indigenous leaders, helping to deliver relevant messages to the members of the Assembly for the respect of indigenous people's rights, their knowledge, and their valuable contribution to UNEP's mandate. 15 resolutions were adopted, with several recognizing the important contribution of indigenous peoples to environmental conservation and sustainable development, such as Resolution 6.8 on promoting sustainable lifestyles, and Resolution 6.12 on environmental assistance and recovery in areas affected by armed conflicts. During the upcoming UNEA 7, under the theme Advancing Sustainable Solutions for a Resilient Planet, we are planning to celebrate the resilience and adaptability of indigenous communities while fostering their meaningful participation in the development of global environmental policy. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and the International Land Coalition are collaborating to advance community-led ecosystem restoration with a focus on recognizing indigenous people's rights to land and resources as the cornerstone of the restoration movement. UNEP's 7th Global Environmental Outlook conducted dialogues to draw upon indigenous knowledge, considering the principles of free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous knowledge holders. Indigenous peoples have played a crucial role in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. Their knowledge and expertise are instrumental in these discussions. We look forward to continuing to support their active role in the 5th session to take place at the Palais des Nations in Geneva August this year. Finally, UNEP is committed to supporting the Permanent Forum in implementing its 6 mandates and recognizes that the path to achieving sustainable development in environmental and developmental justice is grounded in respecting and including indigenous people's perspectives. Thank you.
I thank the representative of UNAP. I now call the representative of Chirapas, Centro de Culturas Indígenas de Perú.
Presidenta del Foro Permanente y miembros, Sistema de las Naciones Unidas. Desde Chirapac y el Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas de las Américas, ETNIA, que articula y representa a mujeres y juventudes indígenas organizadas de 23 países del continente, con vida propia desde hace 30 años. Reconocemos que desde la adopción de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos y Pueblos Indígenas existen avances importantes. Sin embargo, estos no han contribuido de manera significativa al respeto de nuestros derechos individuales y colectivos en el plano nacional y local. Seguimos enfrentando múltiples violencias con las exclusiones, la apropiación ilícita de conocimientos, las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas, la trata y explotación sexual por la presencia de industrias extractivas, el narcotráfico, la criminalización y desaparición forzada de defensoras, agudizada por el no acceso a la justicia. El ETNIA se permite hacer las siguientes recomendaciones a los estados y al sistema de las Naciones Unidas, solicitando su implementación con plena participación de las organizaciones indígenas. Implementar la Recomendación General 39 de la CEDAW sobre los derechos de las mujeres y niñas indígenas de acuerdo a la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de pueblos indígenas, garantizando su incorporación en las políticas y planes nacionales. Adoptar e implementar políticas interculturales e integrales de atención, prevención y erradicación de violencias multidimensionales que afectan a las mujeres y juventudes indígenas, tomando como referentes las prácticas y estrategias indígenas, promoviendo el involucramiento de hombres indígenas. Incorporar el enfoque intercultural, interseccional, intergeneracional y de género en las políticas y programas en materia de salud, educación, economía, agricultura, medio ambiente, cambio climático, cuidados y justicia, garantizando presupuestos etiquetados para su implementación efectiva. Medir y reconocer los aportes de las mujeres y juventudes y pueblos indígenas a la economía mediante indicadores y mecanismos adecuados, asegurando marcos legales, financiamiento que fortalezcan sus capacidades, respetando su derecho a la libre asociación. Las mujeres indígenas aspiramos a una vida fundamentada en los principios de reciprocidad, cuidado y protección, que garantice la sostenibilidad, la dignidad y el bienestar en plano de todas las mujeres, juventudes y niñas indígenas. Desde ETNIA, reafirmamos nuestro compromiso y disposición para trabajar conjuntamente en la construcción de un futuro más justo, equitativo y democrático, en armonía con nuestros pueblos y la madre tierra. Gracias.
I thank the representative of Chirapat. I now call upon the representative of Ecuador.
Imanaya Yunata, Yucashuti, Pachala, Ecuador, Yactamanta, Chamuy. Señora Presidenta, el Ecuador es un país plurinacional e intercultural que procura el acceso a los derechos individuales y colectivos de los pueblos y nacionalidades indígenas. Promueve el respeto a su integridad y dignidad, lucha contra toda expresión de racismo y discriminación y promueve su participación sustantiva en todos los ámbitos de la vida social. La Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas reconoce en los ámbitos de su mandato que los Estados tienen la responsabilidad de garantizar el acceso de las personas indígenas a condiciones de bienestar. Para alcanzar este objetivo, el Ecuador ha diseñado una serie de políticas, proyectos y programas que a continuación menciono. Se ha creado la Secretaría de Gestión y Desarrollo de los Pueblos y Nacionalidades. Con esta institución se trabaja para alcanzar el desarrollo socioeconómico y cultural de las comunas, comunidades y organizaciones mediante la gestión de recursos públicos, privados y de cooperación internacional. Asimismo, el Ecuador ha promovido la inclusión financiera de los pueblos indígenas y fortaleciendo sus capacidades productivas. En el ámbito de la cultura, el Ecuador impulsó la Declaración del Año Internacional de las Lenguas Indígenas, la Declaración del Diseño y Internacional de las Lenguas Indígenas y su implementación a nivel nacional y local. En términos educativos, el Ecuador cuenta con una Secretaría de Educación Intercultural y una educación que tiene como propósito facilitar servicios educativos, revitalizando su pertinencia cultural y lingüística a niños y jóvenes de 18 pueblos y 15 nacionalidades indígenas. El acceso a los servicios de salud es prioritario. El Ministerio de Salud ha fortalecido la Dirección de Salud Intercultural, Derecho y Participación Social, que promueve el respeto al conocimiento y prácticas tradicionales de los pueblos indígenas sobre las medicinas ancestrales. El Ecuador reconoce el derecho de los pueblos indígenas a participar activamente en la toma de decisiones sobre los asuntos que les concierne, incluyendo la consulta previa, libre e informada, el derecho a la resistencia, así como el respeto al debido proceso, a la libertad de expresión y la no criminalización de la protesta social. Están constitucionalmente garantizados. Además, el Estado ecuatoriano es uno de los pocos que consagra en su Constitución los derechos de la naturaleza. La implementación de estas acciones, entre otras, evidencian el compromiso del Gobierno Nacional del presidente Noboa de continuar trabajando para procurar condiciones de bienestar y dignidad de los pueblos y nacionalidades indígenas y garantizan la protección de sus derechos individuales y colectivos. Muchas gracias. Yupaychana.
I thank the representative of Ecuador. I now call upon the representative of ILO.
Distinguida presidenta, distinguidas panelistas, la OIT agradece la oportunidad de contribuir a la discusión del foro sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y la construcción de la paz. Se trata de un debate importante y oportuno, ya que los conflictos violentos siguen impidiendo el disfrute de estos derechos y repercuten gravemente en la forma de vida de los pueblos indígenas. También existe el riesgo de que surjan nuevos conflictos a medida que se intensifica la competencia por el acceso a los recursos naturales. El respeto y la realización de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, incluidos sus derechos a la tierra y a la participación en la toma de decisiones, son esenciales para poner fin a los conflictos y prevenirlos. El convenio de la OIT sobre pueblos indígenas y tribales, número 169, establece que los pueblos indígenas deberán tener el derecho a decidir sus propias prioridades en lo que atañe al proceso de desarrollo, en la medida que éste afecte a sus vidas, creencias, instituciones y bienestar espiritual, y a las tierras que ocupan o utilizan de alguna manera, y de controlar, en la medida de lo posible, su propio desarrollo económico, social y cultural. El convenio número 169 ha desempeñado un papel fundamental en los procesos de paz de varios países, como Guatemala, Nepal y Colombia. La ratificación del convenio ha servido para fomentar la confianza entre las partes y proporcionar un marco para responder a los agravios históricos y no atendidos de los pueblos indígenas. Sin embargo, la consecución de la paz no termina con la firma de los acuerdos y la ratificación del convenio número 169. Un paso siguiente es poner en marcha un proceso sostenido de seguimiento y aplicación con la participación plena y efectiva de los pueblos indígenas, incluido por lo tanto la de las mujeres. La OIT ha apoyado activamente a los países que han utilizado el convenio número 169 como marco para la paz. En Colombia hemos estado trabajando con instancia especial de alto nivel para los pueblos indígenas, para los pueblos étnicos y AMPES, a fin de fortalecer su capacidad para garantizar un seguimiento eficaz a la aplicación del capítulo étnico. En Guatemala, la OIT apoya la construcción de marcos normativos. En Chile, acompañamos el trabajo de la Comisión Presidencial para la Paz y el Entendimiento, destacando el papel del convenio número 169 como marco de referencia y contribución a la paz. Esperamos seguir colaborando y estableciendo alianzas para construir la paz con los pueblos indígenas y los gobiernos, aprovechando al mismo tiempo las contribuciones de las organizaciones de empleadores y de trabajadores. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of the ILO. I now call upon the representative of the National Association of Friendship Centers on behalf of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus.
I speak today on behalf of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, a collective of Indigenous youth from around the world. While our homelands and contexts differ, we are united by our shared commitment to justice, self-determination, and the well-being of future generations. We humbly and collectively submit the following recommendations. We call upon all member states to fully and meaningfully implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We call upon member states to oppose the actions of oppressive regimes and to recognize and uphold Indigenous rights regardless of geography, whether we live within our inherent territories or in urban, rural, or displaced settings. We urge member states to provide core, sustained funding to Indigenous communities and organizations to support essential services and ensure the economic, social, and cultural well-being of our peoples for generations to come. We call on United Nations agencies to increase Indigenous youth participation across all UN bodies and frameworks. This includes expanding funding opportunities and permanently reducing barriers to youth engagement and access. We urge financial institutions to cease funding extractive projects that violate free, prior, and informed consent, UNDRIP, and intersectionality equity standards. Instead, they must redirect social finance toward collective well-being and ensure meaningful Indigenous youth representation and governance. As Indigenous youth, we recognize that the world is facing multiple intersecting crises: climate, political, and economic. Member states often find themselves caught between economic interests and climate obligations, and far too often, Indigenous peoples bear the consequences of decisions made in pursuit of profit over protection. Even in the era of the so-called just transition, we witness the promotion of false solutions that monetize the climate crisis while continuing to dispossess our peoples and exploit our lands and bodies. Indigenous peoples, especially youth, have long been displaced from their territories in search of education, work, and safety, which continues today. When the opportunities needed for our survival are confined to specific regions, our freedom of mobility is treated as a risk rather than upheld as a right. This reality speaks to Article 9 of UNDRIP, which affirms our right to belong to our communities and to exercise our collective and individual rights wherever we should reside. The goals outlined in UNDRIP and other multilateral frameworks cannot be realized without full and meaningful inclusion of Indigenous youth. Self-determination requires youth leadership. All our relations.
Friendship Centers on behalf of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, I now call upon the representative of Cuba.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta. Hoy renovamos nuestro firme respaldo a la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. La plena implementación de este instrumento internacional es esencial para garantizar que las comunidades indígenas puedan ejercer plenamente sus derechos económicos, sociales y culturales. Reafirmamos con convicción el derecho inalienable de los pueblos indígenas a la libre determinación, un derecho que debe ser respetado y promovido en todas sus formas. Asimismo, apoyamos la protección de sus vínculos con las tierras que habitan, lo que incluye la preservación de sus prácticas agrícolas tradicionales y sostenibles, que son fundamentales tanto para su supervivencia como para la conservación de la biodiversidad global. Reconocemos la contribución vital de los pueblos indígenas en la preservación de la biodiversidad y el uso sostenible de los recursos naturales, un rol que no se reconoce suficientemente, pero que tiene un valor crucial para la salud del planeta y las generaciones venideras. Señora Presidenta, es profundamente lamentable que aún en pleno siglo XXI los pueblos indígenas sigan siendo despojados de sus tierras y recursos, sometidos a intereses políticos y económicos que socavan sus derechos fundamentales. Este despojo ocurre incluso en países que se autodenominan defensores de los derechos humanos, como los Estados Unidos, un hecho que no podemos ignorar. Queremos reiterar desde este foro que los pueblos indígenas tienen en Cuba un aliado firme en su lucha por el reconocimiento y la defensa de sus derechos. El apoyo de nuestro país a las comunidades indígenas ha superado el marco de las Naciones Unidas. La colaboración cubana basada en el humanismo, la profesionalidad y la solidaridad ha contribuido al desarrollo social de muchos pueblos, incluidas comunidades indígenas. Por ejemplo, los profesionales cubanos de la salud que han brindado asistencia médica en sitios tan intrincados como la Amazonía. y el método de enseñanza cubano Yo Sí Puedo, que ha beneficiado a comunidades indígenas en Australia, Mozambique, México, Haití, Venezuela, Bolivia y otros países de América. Nos comprometemos a seguir apoyando los legítimos reclamos de los pueblos indígenas, a luchar por la preservación de sus culturas, identidades y territorios, que son, sin lugar a dudas, los cimientos históricos de nuestras naciones. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Cuba. I now call upon the representative of the FAO.
Distinguished Chair, honorable elders, indigenous leaders, youth, foreign experts and country representatives, FAO congratulates Maluki Kotier for her election as chair of the forum. FAO remains fully committed to the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Secretary General Gutierrez's opening words give us added strength to continue opening spaces of policy dialogue within FAO for effective indigenous peoples' participation. The FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit works hard to maintain these spaces where indigenous peoples can lead key discussions on their food and knowledge systems. In 2024, the FAO Technical Committee on Agriculture, COAG, agreed to review the International Code of Conduct on Pesticides Management to include indigenous peoples' rights and ethics. FAO is committed to this important process. I take this opportunity to acknowledge the key role of the International Indian Treaty Council alongside the UN Permanent Forum, the Special Rapporteurs on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and on Toxics and Human Rights, and WHO and PAHO. In October, the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems will meet. The reports on the impacts of ultra-processed foods requested by indigenous youth and the one on co-creation of knowledge in alignment with UNDRIP will be finalized. The Global Hub now counts 36 members and is proud to welcome EMRIP as well. FAO recognizes indigenous peoples as the best experts on ecosystem restoration in the world. Within the UN Decade of Restoration, FAO is working with indigenous peoples in 7 countries on indigenous biocentric restoration. Since 2017, FAO has been working closely with the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. Thanks to the support from the UN Permanent Forum and the hard work of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, in 2021, the UN Global Forum for Indigenous Youth became a reality after a recommendation from the UN Permanent Forum to FAO in 2019. For the 3rd session of this important forum, the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus and FAO are currently looking into possible formulas to identify the necessary funding to ensure both the organization of the 3rd session and the continuity of the UN Global Indigenous Youth Forum in the future. This year is the 80th anniversary of the creation of FAO. 2025 will host a series of celebrations aimed at reminding us of the importance of eradicating hunger, malnutrition, and food insecurity across the globe. FAO considers indigenous peoples as key allies and unique holders of knowledge. In closing, FAO thanks the indigenous peoples and organizations that we have the honor to work alongside in all of these processes. FAO is committed to continue working alongside the UN Permanent Forum, ENRI, and supporting the work of the Special Rapporteur. You can count on FAO's support, dedication, and work to ensure the implementation of UNDRIP. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of FAO. I now call upon the representative of Indigenous World Association.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canada commends the Permanent Forum for the report on the imperative of Indigenous peace building. While all 7 recommendations are essential, we would like to emphasize 2 in particular to be included in your report. First, recommendation 5, calling on all states to empower Indigenous peoples to be active participants in peace building, governance, and resource management processes. Is essential importance in the many contexts globally where Indigenous peoples are impacted by armed conflict. Active participation in decision-making is an essential component to the right of self-determination. Measures to ensure active participation of Indigenous peoples must be implemented consistent with the standard of free, prior, informed consent. Second, recommendation 7 calls on states to operationalize the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and integrate it into national legislation. Operationalization also must include the development, in consultation, and cooperation of Indigenous peoples comprehensive national action plans to fully implement the Declaration. The General Assembly made a strong commitment to indigenous peace building in their December 2024 resolution, recognizing the importance of meaningfully engaging indigenous peoples in peace agreement negotiations, transitional justice processes, conflict resolution, mediation, and constructive arrangements is commendable. However, recognition is not enough. Meaningful engagement also requires respect. Implementation legislation and national action plans are important tools to operationalize the Declaration. Such plans must be developed in cooperation and in consultation with indigenous peoples with their prior, and informed consent. They must also include concrete action items with the appropriate timeline fulfillment of all 7 of the permanent forum's recommendations on peace building. Peace building is a critical theme in the Declaration that represents the urgent needs of indigenous peoples caught in armed conflict and who continue to experience violent invasion and occupation of their lands. Article 7.2 of the Declaration recognizes the collective right of all indigenous peoples to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples, not subject to any acts of genocide or any acts of violence. Likewise, Article 30, the Declaration clearly condemns the unjust militarization of indigenous peoples in their lands. World peace cannot be accomplished without the full and equal participation of indigenous peoples. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of the Indigenous World Association. I now call upon the representative of Brazil. Thank you, Chair. In Brazil, we have indigenous archaeological findings dated by 12,000 years. Brazilian archaeology, not only in the Amazon, needs recovering indigenous history. Colonization meant contact, and contact meant death by diseases such as measles and influenza. Then came land dispossession and extractivism in industrial scale, with linguistic policies imposing Portuguese on people, either by sending settlers to the Amazon or by prohibiting other languages. During our civil military dictatorship, a law was passed to assimilate indigenous peoples to the surrounding society, and FUNAI had the tutelage over indigenous peoples. Recently, that has changed. We have no transitional justice yet, neither regarding the effects of colonization or dictatorship. Systematic racism represents systemic racism represents one of the greatest obstacles to achieving positive peace. According to our most recent census in 2022, the indigenous population represents 0.8% of Brazilian population. This is 1.7 million people. Another information the census brings is that more than half of our indigenous population lives outside demarcated territories. In the actional government, only 13 indigenous territories have been demarcated because of the temporal landmark discussion at the Supreme Court. But our ministry aims to advance the land tenure process for 150 territories until the end of 2026. The Ministry of Indigenous Peoples was created 2 years ago, and we truly hope it fulfills its purpose and continues to exist beyond the next election. For the first time in history, indigenous leaders are at the core of decision-making process. Legislative and judiciary posts have been occupied by indigenous leaders, and we hope occupying public spaces changes our public policy. Thank you, Chair. I thank the representative of Brazil. I now call upon the representative of the UN Population Fund.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm honored to deliver these remarks on behalf of the United Nations Population Fund. UNFPA remains committed to support the rights of indigenous peoples, particularly women and girls. This commitment is grounded in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and is reinforced through the work of the Permanent Forum on on Indigenous issues. Indigenous peoples face severe health disparities, including in sexual and reproductive health. Indigenous women experience significantly higher rates of maternal mortality and morbidity, compounded limited access to quality health care. Additional key issues include higher adolescent birth rates, lack of antenatal care, and higher rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls. These disparities are rooted in systemic racism, gender discrimination, and cultural, economic, and political barriers that prevent Indigenous peoples from accessing quality health care. In direct response to the recommendation from the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2024, UNFPA has taken targeted action to address some of these concerns in partnership with Indigenous communities and organizations. In our programming, we emphasize the importance of culturally appropriate health care and the active participation of Indigenous peoples in policy making processes that affect their rights. We advocate and provide technical support for the collection, analysis, and dissemination of disaggregated data that helps to shed light on the health challenges facing Indigenous peoples. We are focusing on interculturally appropriate maternity care and have mapped successful practices that support sexual, reproductive, maternal, newborn, and adolescent health among Indigenous women and girls. UNFPA, working with Indigenous representatives and relevant UN partners, is in the process of updating the 2018 fact sheet on Indigenous women and girls maternal health. It also organized a regional and intercultural maternal health symposium late last year in Mexico with the support and participation of Indigenous traditional birth attendants. As an outcome of the symposium, the participants called to action that emphasized the need to implement commitments to eliminate discrimination and ensure health care services are appropriate for Indigenous peoples. It also calls for the recognition and integration of the role of traditional birth attendants in health systems. UNFPA reaffirms its commitment to working with Indigenous peoples to address these health challenges, achieving universal health coverage, and realizing the Sustainable Development Goals for all. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UN Population Fund. I now call upon the representative of the Association des Peuples Autochtones de Chad.
Madam Chair, esteemed delegates, and my Indigenous brothers, sisters, aunties, and uncles. Halia, Yama, hello. I'm Lindsay Davies, a proud Guamu Kuma man from southwest Queensland, Australia. The colonial justice system continues to oppress Indigenous youth, stripping our young people of their future. Children as young as 10 can be imprisoned in every Australian jurisdiction except the ACT, where the age is 12. This falls short of international standards and continues to target Indigenous children disproportionately. This is not justice. It's the punishment of trauma, poverty, and systemic neglect. I fear this leads our children to a lifetime of inequity, pain, and heartache. The statistics are damning. Indigenous children comprise over 50% of the youth detention population, while making up less than 6% of the general youth population. Indigenous children are 23 times more likely to be in detention than their non-Indigenous peers. Among children aged 10 to 13 in detention, 82% are Indigenous. These numbers are an indictment of systems designed without us and used against us. This is a breach of Articles 7, 17 and 22 of the Declaration, and CRC Articles 3, 6 and 37. Further, Article 27 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties clarifies that states cannot use domestic law to excuse these breaches, reinforcing its duty to uphold international human rights for Indigenous youth. You cannot honour the Declaration while punishing children. Incarceration is not care. What kind of system chooses to imprison a child instead of helping them heal? I urge the Permanent Forum to recommend the following actions. 1. Call upon all UN member states, including Australia, to raise the minimum age of criminal responsibility to at least 14 years in accordance with the General Comment number 24 of the UN Committee of the Rights of the Child. 2. Request the UN Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to conduct a special review of Australia's compliance with 100 and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, provide a report back to the Forum by its 25th session. 3. Urge all member states, including Australia, to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, enabling children to bring complaints directly to the UN where domestic protections fail. 4. Call upon all member states, including Australia, to promote Indigenous-led youth development, prevention and intervention strategies that facilitate Indigenous youth prosperity. Our children deserve to grow up proud, safe and free. Thank you.
I now call upon the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Hermanos, hermanas, Hatulapaiko y Chuculicanapa, reciban un saludo del Estado Plurinacional de Bolivia, tierra de pueblos diversos, sabiduría milenaria, lucha permanente y rebelde por nuestros derechos. Durante muchos años hemos enfrentado procesos desgarradores de destotalización, fragmentación, desenetización de nuestros pueblos. Nuestros territorios han sido saqueados, nuestras culturas vulneradas y nuestras voces silenciadas, pero nuestras raíces milenarias siguen firmes y profundas. En el ámbito del desarrollo económico y social hay que cambiar de visión. Para nosotros no existe el desarrollo. Es un mito creado por el occidente capitalista y moderno que solo satisface las necesidades de los países del norte y crea desigualdad y pobreza en los pueblos del sur global. Nuestro camino es el de vivir bien en armonía y equilibrio con la Pachamama, la Madre Tierra, que es el retorno a la cultura de la vida, suma tamaño y causa. Los pueblos indígenas originarios somos herederos de culturas ancestrales y milenarias. Nuestros códigos de vida están protegidos en nuestros idiomas, rituales, ceremonias, tejidos, danzas, músicas, símbolos. Tenemos que proyectar nuestro conocimiento y sabiduría al mundo para dar solución a la múltiple crisis global estructural del paradigma civilizatorio occidental. Pedimos al Foro apoyar la iniciativa de Bolivia de institucionalizar y difundir la plataforma virtual sobre los códigos de vivir bien de los pueblos ancestrales del mundo. Es un aporte de los pueblos indígenas originarios de Bolivia para construir la nueva totalidad de nuestro pensamiento. Con relación a temas ambientales, hemos reconocido a la Madre Tierra como un sujeto jurídico. Pedimos al Foro impulsar la convocatoria por la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas y una Asamblea de la Madre Tierra y una Cumbre de la Madre Tierra el 2030. Con relación a temas educativos, hay que iniciar con urgencia un proceso de descolonización de la academia liderado por la Universidad de las Naciones Unidas, incluyendo en el proceso académico científico a las cosmovisiones y valores ecocéntricos de los pueblos indígenas originarios. Pedimos también defender a la hoja de coca, nuestra mama. El Foro Permanente debe solicitar a la UNESCO reconocer a la hoja de coca y los códigos del vivir bien como parte del patrimonio cultural y material de la humanidad. La hoja de coca también debe ser reconocida por la Organización Mundial de la Salud por su alto valor medicinal ancestral. La OMS debe incorporar una opinión autorizada sobre los aspectos antropológicos y uso ancestral en el informe sobre el examen crítico en relación a la hoja de coca que provenga de este foro permanente.
I thank the representatives of the plurinational state of Bolivia for their statement. I now call upon the representative of the Global Naga Forum.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. I am honored to address this forum today as a representative of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, speaking on behalf of the Naga people. The Naga people are members of WPLO, a platform of solidarity committed to amplifying the voices of peoples and nations and securing their equal participation at a national and international level. For over 70 years, the indigenous Naga people living in northeast India and northwest Myanmar have asserted their right to self-determination. 11 years have passed since the signing of the framework agreement between the Indian government and Naga representatives, a peace agreement which was seen as a hopeful step towards resolving decades of violence and repression. The agreement remains unimplemented. Today, the Nagas continue to live under the threat of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Under this law, extrajudicial killings and intimidation persist with impunity. Additionally, the recent construction of a border fence between India and Myanmar has led to the dismantling of the freedom of movement regime, severing ties between Naga communities divided by the border and depriving their rights to their ancestral land. In addition to these ongoing injustices, there is a more insidious threat: the growing climate of intimidation that silences indigenous voices. For years, the Naga human rights and civil society organizations have participated in this space. This year, UNPO speaks on their behalf. Why? The Nagas are being silenced. Naga human rights defenders are increasingly unable to travel, restricted by Indian authorities, and are targeted by acts of intimidation. Their safety is at risk because speaking out can, and often does, lead to reprisals. It should be them taking this seat today. This silencing is not unique to the Naga people. It is part of a broader pattern around the globe where indigenous communities who seek to hold actors accountable are silenced by states. If peace building is to be dynamic and inclusive, it must account for the voices that are silenced. Restorative justice cannot begin where peace agreements are ignored and where those advocating for justice are persecuted. When states block dialogue and punish those who speak, peace is not built, it is dismantled. And in the case of the Nagas, this dismantling has undermined the prospect of a durable and peaceful resolution. We call on member states to achieve the ends of the UNDRIP in accordance with Article 38, ensuring indigenous peoples' right to self-determination and their equal and effective participation in decision-making processes. Specifically, we call on member states to urge the government of India to implement the framework agreement, repeal the AFSPA, and reinstate the freedom of movement regime, and to uphold Articles 30 and 36 of the Declaration to protect the rights of the Naga indigenous peoples whose lands span international borders and to prohibit the militarization of their territories. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Global Naga Forum. I now call upon the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Chair. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Kingdom of Denmark. With the attention given to Greenland in the last few months, I'm pleased to take the floor today to report on the most recent developments in Greenland. On 7 April, a new government took office in Greenland. The new government is a broad coalition of 4 of the 5 parties in the Inatsisartut, the Greenland Parliament, representing 75% of the votes cast. The new government is firmly committed to ensure stability and societal cohesion in Greenland at a time where external actors seek to influence our national development. In such a situation, the government of Greenland believes that it is decisive that we as a people, the Greenland Inuit and our political parties stand together to pave the way for further enhancing our self-determination. The government of Greenland will ensure a clear and realistic timeframe for taking steps towards independence. For the government of Greenland, this is not about turning our backs to others, but to take responsibility for our own future and for developing a nation that is built on freedom, democratic principles, unity, and our unique Arctic identity. It is the firm position of my government, the government of Greenland, that the future of Greenland will be formed by us and for us. The forming of a new government in Greenland also comes at a time where the Kingdom of Denmark takes over the chairship of the Arctic Council. It will be Greenland that takes on the leading role during the chairship. This reflects the Kingdom of Denmark's firm commitment to the peoples of the Arctic. The Arctic Council should be a forum that feels relevant for people living in the Arctic, not least Arctic indigenous peoples. This also means that one of our focus areas will be on sustainable economic empowerment and development, while respecting our precious environment, biodiversity, and in fighting climate change. The Kingdom of Denmark wishes to work with all parties that respects the development in the Arctic based on UN DRIP and international law in general. Thank you, Chair.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement. I now call upon the representative of UNA.
Chairperson, Indigenous peoples often face higher rates of health risks, greater unmet needs for health and social services, and poorer health outcomes than non-Indigenous populations. Indigenous peoples in some contexts are more vulnerable to and disproportionately affected by HIV, tuberculosis, and hepatitis C due to multiple and intersecting inequalities that they face, including racism, poverty, discrimination, and marginalization. Through various initiatives, UNAIDS ensures that the rights and health needs of Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, are part of its efforts. We remain committed to promoting intercultural sensitivity and inclusivity in planning and delivery, addressing the root causes of the HIV disparities faced by Indigenous communities. UNAIDS is dedicated to addressing the significant disparities in HIV prevalence among Indigenous peoples, particularly in Latin America, where in some areas rates can be up to 6 times higher than in the general population. This alarming situation arises from systemic challenges, including the lack of decentralized, differentiated, and interculturally sensitive health approaches tailored to the specific HIV needs of Indigenous communities. The Global AIDS Strategy for 2021-2026 and the 2021 UNGA Political Declaration on HIV/AIDS have, for the first time, recognized Indigenous peoples as a priority population for HIV response. Both documents set bold targets to be met by 2025 among all demographic groups and geographic settings. Work is underway to develop the next Global AIDS Strategy for 2026-2031. It will inform deliberations of the 2026 high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly and its expected political declaration. It is important to ensure that the progress and challenges in addressing the AIDS epidemic among Indigenous people are adequately considered in the development of the new AIDS strategy. Meaningful participation and contribution of Indigenous peoples will be essential. The current representation of Indigenous peoples in the NGO delegation of the UNAIDS Program Coordinating Board is an important avenue for effectively including community voices in the development of the new strategy. Indigenous peoples organizations have also been invited to participate in the global consultations on community leadership and regional and country consultations in Latin America and the Caribbean. UNAIDS calls on member states, the United Nations, and other stakeholders and partners to strengthen efforts for the empowerment and participation of the Indigenous peoples in the decision-making related to their health, including HIV. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of UNAIDS for their statement. I now call upon the representative of the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council.
Am I on? Thank you, Madam Chair. We pay respect to our elders and ancestors past and present. Thank the Indigenous experts and participants here today. Indigenous people were robbed when the Australian government breached regional forest agreements in 1999. Regional forest agreements were in line with Chapter 26 of Agenda 21 of the United Nations Handbook for a Plan on Global Action that recognises the lands of Indigenous peoples and their communities should be protected from activities that are environmentally unsound or the Indigenous people concerned considered to be socially and culturally inappropriate. During late 1999, the state and federal government of Australia took by force regional forest agreement granted Indigenous fisheries beach lands. These lands were taken through defence compulsory acquisition to accommodate the state and federal export and trade, and also the relocation of the defence operations to make way for the 2000 Olympic Village. Seizure of fishery beach represents a breach of the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. Article 30.1 states, military activities shall not take place in the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples unless justified by a relevant public interest or otherwise agreed with or requested by the Indigenous people concerned. I hereby request the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues to urge the Australian government to compensate Eden Local Aboriginal Land Council to cover losses incurred with the above mentioned compulsory acquisition. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council for their statement. I now call upon the representative of Guatemala for their statement.
Señora Presidenta, distinguidos miembros del Foro Permanente, en nombre del Gobierno de Guatemala, Presidente Bernardo Arévalo de León, agradecemos este espacio de diálogo fundamental para la promoción e implementación de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en todo el mundo. En mi calidad de comisionada coordinadora de la Comisión Presidencial contra la Discriminación y el Racismo contra los pueblos indígenas en Guatemala, me complace destacar que la Administración ha implementado procesos que han orientado programas a proyectos de la institucionalidad del Estado guatemalteco, posicionando la importancia de incrementar el 26% de asignaciones presupuestarias a favor de los pueblos indígenas. En el año 2024 se adoptó una agenda de trabajo multidisciplinario con las autoridades indígenas de diferentes municipios, quichés, ixiles, el Parlamento Xinca y organizaciones del pueblo garí. Las agendas temáticas contemplan una serie de compromisos del organismo ejecutivo con los pueblos indígenas, fomentando acuerdos enfocados en la protección y preservación del medio ambiente y la biodiversidad, el incremento de la inversión para la reactivación de las economías locales, la cobertura en los servicios de salud y el fortalecimiento de la educación bilingüe e intercultural, entre otros. En este contexto, las autoridades indígenas tienen la facultad de observar, auditar y formular su cumplimiento. La participación de los pueblos indígenas en espacios de diálogo y de toma de decisión ha marcado un hito en la historia de mi país, no solamente en la lucha contra la discriminación racial, sino para garantizar que íntegramente seamos escuchados y valorados para ejercernos libremente nuestros derechos. Aunque nos siguen criminalizando la justicia a través del Ministerio Público. Hace apenas 2 días fueron capturados 2 de los grandes líderes que lucharon para defender la democracia en el 2023. La Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, hemos avanzado en la formulación de instrumentos estratégicos para potenciar la participación de los pueblos indígenas. Creemos que para que exista un desarrollo sostenible es imprescindible garantizar la participación plena y efectiva de nosotros, los pueblos indígenas, en los asuntos que nos conciernen, reflejando así una verdadera representación basada en el respeto, la justicia y el diálogo intercultural para la aplicación de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en todas las regiones. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Guatemala for their statement. I now call upon the representative of San Miguel.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. My name is Sara Elvira Bokmanen, and I'm the president of the Sami Youth Association Samivoda. For Sami youth, it is difficult to understand how Nordic states can easily claim to uphold human rights, while at the same time continuing to exploit indigenous lands, causing irreversible environmental damages, generating profit at the expense of others, and sacrificing the Sami people in the name of the green transition, and calling this sustainable. Sami is treated as a resource extraction zone, an industrial area where decision makers act ruthless. In Kiruna, the Swedish state-owned mining company LKAB has been exploiting Sami lands for over 130 years. Now it plans to open even more mines, once again justified by the green transition.
Swedish government celebrated the recent discovery of rare earth minerals in Finland as a key to Europe's green future, especially in the light of the EU's new Critical Raw Materials Act, where they don't even include active fibers.
For the Sami people, this is not a just transition. It is a collapse of our culture, livelihoods, and future. There is no land left. It has already been taken and exploited, and now even more is at risk. There are no green mines. The damages to nature and indigenous peoples are permanent. The current trend of greenwashing human rights violations by the EU, by the Nordic countries, and by state-owned companies is unacceptable. When even state-owned companies begin to portray exploitations and colonialism as sustainable, using this narrative to ignore and violate indigenous rights, it is clear that the situation has gone too far. We ask the Forum to call on the states to ensure that Sweden and the European Union implement free, prior and informed consent in all relevant legislation and decision-making processes. The companies such as LKAB cannot profit from projects that violate human rights. And also fully implement ILO Convention 169 and ensure that UNRWA is embedded in all national and EU-level legal frameworks and policies. Human rights are non-negotiable. They must always be upheld and respected. Thank you.
For their statement, I now call upon the representative of Papua.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Estimados representantes, el Estado, a través del Instituto Paraguayo del Indígena, coordina acciones con las diversas instituciones estatales en conjunto con las comunidades indígenas, abordando de manera prioritaria el acceso a los servicios públicos en el marco del respeto a sus derechos y su cultura. Nuestro rol institucional de articulación es clave para salvaguardar el enfoque de derechos humanos, la no discriminación, el diálogo intercultural, el respeto a la autodeterminación de los pueblos indígenas, el establecimiento de mecanismos apropiados de participación, información y comunicación como órgano ejecutor y contralor de la consulta y consentimiento libre, previo e informado y de buena fe con los pueblos indígenas. Destacamos la implementación del sistema de protección social vinculado al Plan Nacional de Reducción de la Pobreza y alineado plenamente a los ejes estratégicos del Plan Nacional de Pueblos Indígenas con la creación de mesas de protección social en distritos priorizados, con el abordaje interinstitucional de las comunidades indígenas que la componen. En el ámbito de la salud, destacamos la recolección de saberes tradicionales en cuanto a las prácticas de la medicina tradicional, con importantes aportes, especialmente de las parteras indígenas, quienes en general complementan sus saberes ancestrales con las indicaciones recibidas de los servicios de salud a fin de precautelar la salud de los niños y sus madres. En el ámbito educativo, avanza positivamente el proceso de construcción participativa de los currículos propios de los pueblos indígenas, así como la producción de materiales educativos específicos para cada pueblo. Asimismo, el Paraguay implementa con gran éxito el programa Hambre Cero en las escuelas, con el objetivo de universalizar el almuerzo escolar y erradicar el hambre en la etapa escolar. Es nuestra responsabilidad salvaguardar los derechos de nuestra población a lo largo del ciclo de vida. En ese sentido, la nueva Ley de Pensión Universal para las personas adultas mayores contempla la inclusión de los indígenas desde los 55 años de edad, de manera a mejorar la calidad de vida de los adultos mayores. Señora Presidenta, estimados representantes, el Paraguay renueva su compromiso con los ámbitos de mandato de este foro, con la activa participación de los pueblos indígenas, sus líderes y lideresas, mujeres y jóvenes, quienes nos orientan con su sabiduría y cosmovisión. Oñondi de Pa, Ñandumbare de Beta, Ñanderen de Apo, Agustín. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representatives of Paraguay for their statement. I now call upon the representative of the Association of Indigenous Peoples of Tamir of the Krasnoyarsk territory.
Госпожа председатель, я представляю Ассоциацию 5 коренных народов полуострова Таймыр в России. Декларация ООН о правах коренных народов для коренных народов Таймыра является важным правозащитным инструментом во взаимодействии с государством и промышленным бизнесом. Со ссылкой на положение декларации о доступе к правосудию мы первыми в России создали институт омбудсмена по правам коренных народов. Это национальное правозащитное учреждение позволяет восстанавливать нарушенные индивидуальные и коллективные права, а также осуществлять мониторинг и исправление системных ошибок. Нашему примеру последовали другие регионы страны. На сегодняшний день институт омбудсмена функционирует в 4 регионах. Буквально вчера, в ноябре, был одобрен законопроект, учреждающий должность независимого омбудсмена. Это случилось после 10 лет консультаций. Процедура согласования кандидатуры правозащитника предполагает ключевую роль коренных народов. Более того, после консультаций с нами флагманская горнодобывающая компания утвердила корпоративную политику взаимодействия с коренными народами. В этом обязательном для компании документе коренные народы признаны правообладателями в соответствии с декларацией и другими международными стандартами. Мы добились, чтобы политика установила корпоративный механизм рассмотрения жалоб, роль которого будет исполнять независимый омбудсмен. Мы ожидаем добросовестных консультаций по процедуре назначения омбудсмена. Мы будем добиваться, чтобы другие компании приняли на себя такие же обязательства. Рекомендуем постоянному форуму подготовить руководящие принципы по использованию декларации в правозащитных целях в диалоге с бизнесом. Должен отметить, что мы уже активно используем те исследования членов постоянного форума, которые имеют прикладное значение. Например, исследование бывшего члена форума Алексея Цикарева о применении принципа свободного, предварительного и осознанного согласия в контексте коренных народов. К сожалению, не все исследования членов форума носят практический характер. В некоторых содержатся лозунги и отсутствует связь с реальностью на местах. Мы же хотим получить рекомендации о том, как положения декларации могут быть реализованы с учетом национальной специфики. Благодарю вас за внимание.
I thank the representative of the Association of Indigenous Peoples of Taimyr of the Krasnoyarsk Territory. I now call upon the representative of Philippines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madjao Namasem. I am Jennifer Pia Sipuglas, Chairperson of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, daughter of the late Dato Joseph Guabong Sibu, an indigenous person from Mindanao in the southern part of the Philippines. The Philippines hosts 110 ethno-linguistic groups that includes indigenous cultural communities or indigenous peoples with an estimate of 16 million IPs comprising at least 16% of the Philippine population. On human rights, our Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act safeguards indigenous peoples' rights to their ancestral domains and lands, self-governance and empowerment, social justice and human rights, as well as their preservation of their cultural integrity. In terms of economic and social development, they are empowered to design, plan, and implement their own development programs with ancestral domain, sustainable development, and protection plans. The Philippine government enforces the pre and prior informed consent, which guarantees that no government or private sector project may proceed within ancestral domains without securing the consent of the concerned communities. On culture, the Philippine government recognizes the importance of supporting us in practicing our rituals, ceremonies, and cultural expressions. Together, we are committed to addressing discrimination, cultural misappropriation, and commercialization, and ensuring authentic and respectful representation. Regarding the environment, IPs in the Philippines have long been the stewards of the ancestral domains, playing a vital role in conserving biodiversity and protecting the environment. The country acknowledges that indigenous knowledge systems and practices are integral to environmental preservation. Through the IPRA, the Philippines ensures they retain control over their ancestral lands and are actively involved in decision-making processes regarding natural resource management. In education, the government has implemented plans such as the educational assistance and merit-based scholarship programs to support IP qualified learners to provide meaningful scholarships and are implemented by broader education-related interventions promoting culturally appropriate IP education. On health, the Philippine government through IPRA, the universal health care, ensures that they have access to basic health services, including traditional medicine. The state recognizes the right to health services without discrimination and importance of maintaining their traditional health practices. The Philippines remains committed to the UNDRIP, the 2030 SE Agenda, and the principle of leaving no one behind. By implementing the IPRA, supporting the rights to the indigenous peoples, we continue to contribute a sustainable, inclusive, and just future for all. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Philippines for their statement. I now call upon the representative of Confederación de las Nacionalidades Indígenas del Ecuador for 9 minutes.
Señora Presidenta, un saludo cordial por parte de los pueblos indígenas. Durante este foro hemos escuchado con asombro cómo hermanos indígenas, al convertirse en funcionarios de gobierno de turno, se desprenden de sus territorios y vienen a eventos oficiales de la ONU a adornar con maquillajes de mentiras la dolorosa situación que vivimos los pueblos indígenas en todas partes del mundo, y Ecuador no ha sido la excepción. Los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible 2030 de la ONU abarcan metas sociales, económicas, ambientales que buscan cerrar las brechas de género, erradicar el hambre, promocionar la situación climática o buscar la paz y la transparencia, entre otros propósitos. Sin embargo, en Ecuador, los pueblos indígenas enfrentamos el grave deterioro de las condiciones mínimas de democracia y la vida. El actual gobierno ha radicalizado sus políticas subordinando al Fondo Monetario Internacional, centrando en ajustes fiscales que han provocado un alarmante incremento en los índices de desempleo y pobreza. Por ejemplo, la pobreza rural 42%, pobreza extrema rural 23%, en los pueblos indígenas 59%, lo que convierte en el grupo social más despobrecido del país. Asimismo, el Ecuador se ha convertido en uno de los países más peligrosos del mundo, producto del narcotráfico y de las economías criminales. En todo el continente, los estados están profundizando políticas extractivas, mineras, petroleras, recursos marítimos y privatizaciones de sectores estratégicos para garantizar las ganancias de las grandes corporaciones y capitales privados. Esas políticas se implementan sin reparar en la violación de derechos humanos. Por ejemplo, en Ecuador enfrentamos más de 126 casos de criminalización en contra de defensores de derechos humanos y defensores líderes indígenas. Han violado el derecho a la consulta previa e informada, derecho a la consulta ambiental. Y en ese contexto europeo, en Ecuador pretende ir a una nueva constitución, lo que provocaría la represión de derechos graves, derechos colectivos, derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Por eso recomiendo a este foro, primero, establecer mecanismos de seguimiento y respuesta urgentes de su esfuerzo permanente en coordinación con el sistema de Naciones Unidas. Dos, recomendar al Estado ecuatoriano la adopción inmediata de un protocolo nacional de protección para los intereses. Tres, la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas como un instrumento jurídico de referencia vinculante. Ese es el único camino para conservar nuestras vidas, nuestros territorios, nuestra madre tierra, nuestra madre selva, nuestras montañas, que son a veces de ustedes, porque todos somos seres humanos y como el hermano, hijo de la misma madre tierra. Un abrazo.
Дякую, пані голово, за можливість виступити. Дорогі брати та сестри, шановні представники держав-членів ООН. Дійсний взаємозв'язок наочної взаємозалежність з країнами та їх народами зобов'язують нас заради досягнення цілей сталого розвитку діяти спільно. Очевидно, що зусилля спрямовані на цілі сталого розвитку на національних рівнях потребують особливої організації діяльності глобального партнерства. У зв'язку з з цим ми не можемо не обговорювати політичні та військові чинники, які перешкоджають глобальному партнерству з метою сталого розвитку. Сьогодні в місті Києві, столиці моєї країни України, оголошено День жалоби за жертвами масованої російської ракетної атаки в ніч на 24 квітня, внаслідок якої постраждали майже 90 людей, з яких 12 загинуло. Серед постраждалих були 6 дітей та вагітна жінка. Агресія та загарбницькі війни завжди злочинні, але подвійно злочинні дії Москви з примусу представників корінних народів Росії до участі у злочинній війні проти України. У світі кожен з корінних народів має свою славну, дуже часто трагічну історію. Але всі вони намагаються захищати свій дім, коли до нього вриваються озброєні бандити. Українці і кримські татари теж захищають свій дім, свою державу від озброєних бандитів, які увірвалися за наказом Путіна на українські землі. У зв'язку з цим я закликаю форум приділяти увагу репресіям та переслідуванням кримсько-татарського народу, корінного народу України, чиї мати земля Крим ось уже 11 років, як окупований Російською Федерацією. Нікому і ніколи не має бути дозволено переступати через права корінних народів, у тому числі і право на свою землю. Тому дозвольте на тлі окремих пропозицій щодо Криму заявити про наступне. Крим – це земля корінного кримсько-татарського народу, це його батьківщина і водночас невід'ємна частина української держави. І долю Криму вирішуватимуть лише українська держава та корінний кримсько-татарський народ. Я закликаю лідерів корінних народів бути ще більш сильними та рішучими з метою припинення загарбницьких воєн на землі задля досягнення цілей сталого розвитку. Я вам всім дякую за увагу.
I now call upon the representative of AIM West.
Yad my name is Jean Whitehorse. I'm a Navajo, a daughter of a Navajo code talker, a survivor of the government boarding school, CIA relocation, and the U.S. government forced sterilization campaign against Native women. Between 1907 and 1987, at least 70,000 indigenous women across the U.S. were sterilized without their consent, an act of genocide denying our right to give life. After a medical emergency, I was coerced into signing a form at the Indian Health Service in Gallup, New Mexico. I later discovered that ended my ability to bear children. My Navajo name is many children, yet I have only one daughter. Forced sterilization is a direct violation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, particularly Article 19 through 24, which upholds the right to health, body autonomy, free, prior, and informed consent. These acts also meet the criteria of crime against humanity under the Rome Statute and condemned by the UN Convention against torture and elimination of discrimination against women. In 1920, I shared my story before the forum. The forum responded by recommending a global study on the forced sterilization of indigenous women. These recommendations are outlined in paragraph 58 and 51 of the 1920 report. Today, this study has not yet been initiated. We call upon the permanent forum to implement Recommendation 51 by initiating the study without further delay. We respectfully make the following recommendations. The UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and the Rights of the Indigenous People share jointly investigation that the United States historical and ongoing forced sterilization of indigenous women. That in turn, American Commission of Human Rights and the Organization of the American States should take this matter and recommend reparations for the survivor and the family. All states must implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the national law with specific provision to prohibit forced sterilization of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The United States must issue a formal apology and recognize this policy as the act of genocide. True peace cannot exist without justice, healing, and recognition of our inherent rights.
I thank the representative of Burundi.
Madame la Présidente, en application des articles 12, 13 et 21 de la déclaration, compte tenu du temps, nous allons se limiter uniquement sur les actions entreprises dans le domaine de la santé, de l'éducation et du développement communautaire. La santé est un droit légitime inscrit dans la Constitution du Burundi. Le gouvernement du Burundi, à travers la politique nationale de la santé, vise à assurer l'amélioration continue de l'état de santé de la population. La mesure de gratuité des soins pour les enfants de moins de 5 ans, et de même des femmes enceintes jusqu'à l'accouchement et le renforcement du système des agents de santé communautaire s'est poursuivi et a également permis l'accès aux soins de santé aux préparatoire. Aussi, le gouvernement va poursuivre l'appui aux ménages battoirs par octroi des cartes d'assurance maladie, intégration des ménages battoirs dans le système d'information aux soins de santé, sensibilisation du battoir sur toutes les femmes à se faire soigner aux centres médicaux à temps, ainsi qu'à faire vacciner leurs enfants de moins de 5 ans. Paiement de soins de santé aux plus vulnérables, y compris les battus. En matière de l'éducation, malgré la gratuité de l'éducation de base sur les enfants, il y a toujours des défis, car le chef de ménage ayant un niveau de formation fonctionnelle ou secondaire ne dépasse pas 3% sur les battoirs pour chaque catégorie de formation. Mais nous saluons la volonté du gouvernement à promouvoir les battoirs dans beaucoup de secteurs de la vie du pays. De ce fait, le gouvernement du Burundi a poursuivi les mesures de gratuité de l'éducation fondamentale et l'octroi des kits scolaires aux élèves des familles démunies. Continuer la mise en œuvre de la mesure permettant aux enfants battoirs qui ont réussi du concours national d'accéder aux écoles en régime d'internat depuis 2022. Dans l'avenir, on doit évaluer les possibilités de mettre en place un mécanisme de suivi d'évaluation des élèves battoirs ayant accédé aux écoles en régime d'internat d'une manière pérenne. Orienter et prendre en charge les élèves battoirs dans les écoles professionnelles et à l'appropriation des adultes. Assurer la prise en charge académique des étudiants battoirs. En matière de droit communautaire et social, en application des articles 2023, le gouvernement du Burundi a élaboré une stratégie nationale sur la réintégration socio-économique des personnes extrémistes et l'inclusion des battoirs, laquelle donne des orientations claires en matière de planification pour le développement des battoirs et tout intervenant des bras salinés. Les activités sont prévues entre autres pour foyer d'intercultivar aux personnes battoirs et l'engagement ferme de son excellence président de la République pour fournir un engagement ferme de son excellence président de la République.
I thank the representative of Burundi for their statement. I now call upon the representative of Association Tinhin Nat.
Thank you, Kanile Priana, honorable guest, dear relatives. I would like to really warmly congratulate Aluki Cortier for her election as the chair of the 24th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, but also on her leadership. I would like to also say that I am presenting this statement on behalf of Kininan, but also of the Global Network of Indigenous Peace Builders, Negotiators, and Mediators. And I am supporting the previous statement made by Kenneth on behalf of the Coalition for Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Canada. The world today urgently needs meaningful peace building that works for all, and we saw that currently we are significantly affected by conflicts, and they occur on our territories. The land we steward are not only critical for our own identity and life, but also for the health and well-being of biodiversity. Indigenous peoples have endured violence, displacement, and systemic exclusion for generations. Conflicts have affected our ancestors and continue to impact us. As we speak, 107 wars are displacing over 117 million people worldwide, yet peace efforts remain disconnected from those most affected. Despite this, Indigenous people have long been the real peacekeepers of the world. Our peace-building tradition, like the one from my own people, the Kertemasha, activists is just a way to uphold harmony in our community, but also with the neighboring nations and with Mother Earth for generations. Yet modern peace-building negotiations happen behind closed doors. And I will just go directly to my recommendations. We recommend to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples to keep this in their agenda, Indigenous peace building. We want to acknowledge the work of the DPPA to continue standing also with us to work on peace building and to involve Indigenous peoples in peace building and to strengthen the partnership between the UN member states and philanthropic organizations to advance Indigenous-led peace-building initiatives in alignment with the Resolution 1325, the SDG 5, the SDG 17, and the SDG 16 standard.
I thank the representative of the association, I now call upon the representative of Chile.
Señora Presidenta, distinguidas delegaciones, es realmente un gusto escucharles. Para Chile ha sido un honor participar en esta sesión, afirmando nuestro compromiso con la implementación de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y con una Agenda 2030 que se construye con una participación equitativa y con justicia territorial. Chile asume la Agenda 2030 como una hoja de ruta nacional para avanzar hacia el desarrollo sostenible con enfoque de derechos. En este marco establecimos un Consejo Nacional para la implementación de los ODS, en los cuales se han incorporado activamente los pueblos indígenas. Durante este proceso emergió con fuerza la necesidad de promover la paz, el diálogo intercultural y la equidad territorial como pilares fundamentales para el desarrollo sostenible. Se reafirmó además un compromiso central: garantizar servicios sociales y políticas públicas que reconozcan las particularidades culturales y los derechos colectivos de los pueblos indígenas. Al respecto, queremos destacar los avances más significativos que se vinculan con los diferentes ODS. En el último año, el Ministerio de las Culturas llevó a cabo un proceso de consulta previa para una nueva legislación sobre patrimonio cultural, que derivó en acuerdos con los pueblos indígenas reconocidos en la Ley 19.253, con lo cual se presentaron indicaciones sustitutivas para crear la categoría de patrimonio cultural indígena. En el ámbito de la salud, se promulgó el Reglamento de Salud Intercultural para garantizar el derecho a recibir atención con pertinencia cultural, reconociendo la legitimidad de los sistemas de salud indígenas y estableciendo espacios de participación formal en la elaboración de políticas públicas. Asimismo, el Estado ha elaborado el Plan Decenal de Lenguas Indígenas, cuya implementación comenzará este año. Este plan se articula con un proyecto de ley que reconoce, protege y garantiza los derechos lingüísticos y culturales actualmente en tramitación parlamentaria. En el ámbito de la participación y consulta, Chile mantiene el convenio 169 de la OIT, junto con marcos normativos como la ley indígena y el reglamento de consulta indígena. Bajo este marco se desarrollan actualmente decenas de procesos de consulta indígena, especialmente en sectores como medio ambiente, energía y minería. Señora Presidenta, como ha quedado de manifiesto en nuestras intervenciones anteriores, estamos convencidas de que la plena implementación de la declaración debe integrarse transversalmente en nuestras políticas de desarrollo. Esto no solamente fortalece la cohesión social, sino también contribuye al cumplimiento de la Agenda 2030. Chile se pone a disposición para seguir fortaleciendo políticas públicas con enfoque queda atrás, pero también que nadie se salva solo. Muchas gracias y felicitaciones, Presidenta, por este foro.
I thank the representative Chile for their statement. I now call upon the representative of AXO.
It's with great sadness and rage that I address you all again about sexual violence against UQ and women, which is perpetrated largely by American military personnel who are stationed in our islands. Since Wednesday, we've been processing the news that 3 more women were sexually assaulted and or battered by 2 Marines earlier in the year. According to reports, one of these women was beaten for trying to assist the woman who was being sexually assaulted. It's unfortunate that in its periodic review of Japan last year, that CEDAW did not address the violence against women in the DQs through the lens of CEDAW General Recommendation 39. Instead, choosing to articulate this historical trend as, quote, gender-based violence against women committed by United States military personnel on Okinawa military bases. This is somewhat true, but not limited to on-base interactions. The Osaka High Court stated in 2023 that we are an indigenous people. However, the government of Japan still maintains that we are not. And this abstention from CEDAW is exactly in line with the government's position. Violence against UQ and women is directly related to the military bases in our islands, of which we have 32 U.S. military bases alone. But it's largely been addressed as an unfortunate stressor of the Japan-American relationship and does not consider reparations for survivors of these heinous crimes. Let me be clear, so many U.S. bases, 70.4% of all those in Japan are in BQ because Japan does not want this to happen to Japanese women. Time is always of the essence when dealing with the U.S. military because these are men who are redeployed periodically, which means that they move out of Japanese jurisdiction entirely. These 2 most recent incidents occurred in January and in March. Currently, according to the Status of Forces Agreement between Japan and the U.S., police cannot even interrogate them because they are on base. Police can request base access and then ask them for a voluntary meeting, which they can decline. These are not adequate avenues to effectuate any form of justice, let alone reparations. As always, we call on U.S. bases to get out of UQ. We also call on them to be removed from other islands where they're over-proportionate. We call on the government of Japan to finally ratify the optional protocol to CEDAW and allow a CEDAW inquiry procedure specifically for violence against indigenous UQ women. We also ask that the special rapporteur immediately reach out to both the United States and Japan in the same inquiry letter, so we can get around this old question of whose jurisdiction is it anyways by engaging with both countries in tandem. Okay, thank you.
Their statement. I now call upon the representative of Guyana.
Chair, as a Guyanese indigenous parliamentarian, I will share the progress made by indigenous peoples of Guyana. Today, education, health, healthcare training, and access to indigenous peoples in Guyana is unprecedented. 20 years ago, there was 1 indigenous medical doctor. Today, indigenous doctors form a critical part of the nation's health system. In fact, our entire public sector has seen a growing number of indigenous professionals given increased education access. Land ownership by indigenous peoples has more than doubled in 2 decades to more than 60% of Guyana. The promotion of indigenous culture is mainstream at every level, with September dedicated as Amerindian Heritage Month. Guyana's low-carbon development strategy, endorsed by indigenous leadership and their communities, sees 26.5% of all revenues from carbon credit sales go directly to indigenous villages. Our progressive Amerindian Act of 2006 promotes the principles of FPIC. Consultation is a norm in all engagements with indigenous communities. This act remains relevant and coupled with political will has been the foundation for the indigenous people in Guyana having land security, including the legal requirements of their full consent to any extractive and investment activities on their lands. It is therefore unfortunate that the APA has used this forum to misrepresent the situation of indigenous peoples in Guyana. This organization continues to disregard the very principle of FPIC. It attends this forum without securing FPIC of the people it claims to represent. It undermines the authority of the National Two-Chiefs Council, which comprises 243 elected indigenous leaders. I place on the record that the government of Guyana is supporting the revision of the Amerindian Act. Funding has been allocated for the training of indigenous facilitators to lead nationwide consultation process. Representation from IPOs is included on the Oversight Committee. The APA continues to sit on the multi-stakeholder steering committee that oversees the LCDS, giving them every opportunity to consult and contribute constructively. However, they have attempted to block funding from national and indigenous development. Recently, they alleged that indigenous people were not consulted nor part of the negotiations in the benefit sharing under the LCDS by appealing to R3. The international audit found the allegations to be baseless. Madam Chair, I urge this forum to continue to promote partnership over division. The government of Guyana will continue to advance indigenous development in full partnership with its indigenous people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now call upon the Australian Human Rights Commission.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I make this statement as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Commission. The impact of colonisation around the globe has been devastating for our peoples. The violent invasion of Australia commenced 237 years ago, with massacres continuing up until the late 1920s. As a study for this item points out, colonial violence rarely ceases, it transforms. In making this statement, I acknowledge Bibbulmun Noongar woman Associate Professor Hannah McGlade, current member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and Cobble Cobble woman Professor Megan Davis, who has served on both the Permanent Forum and the Expert Mechanism previously. Both have played a pivotal role in advocating for the rights of children, including through their recent work in co-authoring an urgent complaint regarding youth justice policies and human rights concerns in respect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, which has been submitted to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The Australian Human Rights Commission has provided its endorsement of this complaint. Madam Chair, the failure of systems to support the rights of Indigenous children is a significant human rights challenge globally and is fueling pipelines into negative life trajectories. In Australia, national data shows that First Nations children are 26 times more likely to be in detention than non-Indigenous children. First Nations children exposed to structural and systemic discrimination, poverty and intergenerational trauma stemming from colonisation make up the majority of those in out-of-home care and youth justice systems. All Australian governments have committed to taking steps to reduce the rising levels of exposure through nationally agreed targets focused on First Nations wellbeing. However, Indigenous children in Australia are disproportionately affected by tough-on-crime policy approaches, particularly the regressive measures recently introduced by a number of Australian state and territory governments. These approaches are not consistent with the identified outcomes of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, nor with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Rather, they perpetuate racial profiling and negative stereotyping, condemning our children to a lifetime of abuse, deprivation and disadvantage, a cycle that repeats from generation to generation. Locking up children does not reduce crime, nor does it curb the transition from youth detention to a life with adult incarceration. Evidence-based, community-led and adequately funded prevention and early intervention approaches that centre family, child development and wellbeing and the best interests of children must be the focus. The Australian Human Rights Commission recommends that all states require their governments to commit to evidence-based policies that support the administration of child justice systems consistent with human rights obligations. This includes by ensuring a focus on addressing socio-economic inequalities that result in the overrepresentation of
I thank the representative of the
acknowledges and celebrates the profound heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, the oldest continuing culture on Earth, and is steadfast in ensuring our people thrive. Delivering on this commitment, Australia has focused on our implementation of the 6 mandated areas of the Permanent Forum, which we recognise are fundamental to the well-being of First Nations people. These essential elements are the foundation of a prosperous life. Australia has focused on achieving real and sustainable progress through genuine partnerships with First Nations peoples. The National Agreement on Closing the Gap exemplifies this approach. The invaluable wisdom and expertise of Indigenous Australians, including elders, traditional owners, native title holders, communities and organisations, guide the Coalition of Peaks and the Australian Government in implementing Closing the Gap. Recognising that housing is pivotal to a range of economic and social outcomes, Australia has pledged $4 billion over 10 years to improve housing in remote Northern Territory and communities and homelands. This substantial investment drives significant progress in closing the gap. It aims to halve overcrowding in the remote Northern Territory by 2034 and improve housing quality by delivering up to 2,700 houses and a comprehensive repairs and maintenance program over the decade. Acknowledging the profound impact of food insecurity on health and well-being, Australia has been proactively addressing food security issues in remote Indigenous Australian communities through a national strategy to improve access to affordable and nutritious food. This included $50 million to lower prices of essential food and over $21 million for a remote nutrition workforce. Guided by the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the roadmap of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, share meaningful employment opportunities for job seekers in remote communities to move into paid employment through the Remote Jobs and Economic Development Program have been prioritised. This has created new jobs that remote communities want by funding wages and equipment for local employers so they can hire local talent. Once job seekers have experience in the workforce, the goal is for them to connect with existing opportunities in the public and private sector to increase long-term permanent and local jobs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Australia for their statement. I now call upon the representative of the Sami Parliament in Norway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I give a statement on behalf of the Sami Parliament in Norway. We share the pride of the world's Indigenous peoples' achievements of the past decades, including the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Declaration secures the rights of Indigenous peoples and serves as a minimum standard for the states to follow. However, in many countries, the implementation of the Declaration is still lacking. We recall that 11 years ago at the World Conference, Norway, amongst other states, voted for the state's responsibilities to implement the declaration. The Sami Parliament have repeatedly asked the Norwegian government to make a national action plan for the implementation of the declaration. Even though many times required, no serious steps have been taken to implement the declaration in Norwegian law. Madam Chair, the Permanent Forum has numerous of recommendations that strongly urge states to develop their own national action plans for the full implementation of the declaration. MPIC has recently delivered its report on their country engagement mission to Norway, also recommending that Norway should improve its implementation of the content of the declaration and to develop an action plan. This includes improving the incorporation of free, prior, and informed consent into key legislation. The climate crisis deeply affects our lands, waters, and people. At the same time, others are claiming indigenous lands in the name of the green transition. This affects our traditional livelihoods, the health of our people, and the hopes and possibilities for future generations. Climate solutions need to be based on justice. The declaration includes tools that will enable a just transition, including indigenous people's rights to self-determination and the free, prior informed consent. More states need to implement these tools so we jointly can seek just climate solutions. In conclusion, we see an urgent need to better implementation of the declaration in national levels. We ask the Forum to call on states, including Norway, to fulfill their commitments from the World Conference. We also ask the Permanent Forum to continue its efforts and its guidelines on member states on the implementation of the declaration. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the National Parliament of Norway. I now call upon the representative of the Russian Federation.
Уважаемая госпожа председатель, хотим поблагодарить членов форума за их исследования о вооруженных конфликтах. Несмотря на действительно крайне чувствительный характер этой темы, это исследование позволяет продолжать обсуждать, расширять понимание, как именно вооруженные конфликты могут влиять на права коренных народов. Однако, с учетом последующих выступлений некоторых экспертов, представителей Украины и государства, которое юридически признало само существование коренных народов только после того, как на всенародном, на общем референдуме народа Крыма приняли решение осуществлять свое дальнейшее развитие самостоятельно. Так вот, хочется отметить, что на территории Крыма, где исторически проживают крымские татары и расположенные в традиционные земли, никаких боевых действий не ведется и не велось никогда, за исключением водно-энергетической блокады, которую осуществляла Украина с использованием военных средств и которая действительно подрывала традиционные системы жизнеобеспечения и в том числе продовольственную безопасность крымских татар. И таких фактографических ошибок, и другой подмены понятий и фактосовок в их заявлениях можно отмечать. Уважаемый председатель, 6 областей деятельности мандата постоянного форума, как и права коренных народов, они затрагивают все сферы их жизни, и значит, это их продвижение требует усилий в самых различных областях государственного управления. В этой связи большое значение приобретает система стратегических документов на национальном уровне, которая позволяет координировать эти усилия. И они, в частности, отмечу, что в России действует федеральная концепция и региональные концепции устойчивого развития коренных народов и планы реализации, планы мероприятий по их реализации. Они определяют направление развития законодательства, развития социально-экономических программ, инфраструктуры традиционных земель и так далее. И в последние годы в соответствии с коллективными обращениями коренных народов в адрес президента Российской Федерации у нас ведется государственный учет граждан, причастных к коренным народам, и включение в такой реестр, важно отметить, добровольный и освобождает от бюрократических процедур, связанных с необходимостью подтверждать свои права ими, и облегчает их доступ к реализации своих прав. Мы хотели отметить, что в контексте продвижения на национальном уровне прав коренных народов и их обеспечения необходимо учитывать национальную специфику. И Россия здесь основывается на собственном многовековом опыте взаимодействия с своими коренными народами, и мы подтверждаем свою приверженность и реализацию целей декларации.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now call upon the representative of the autonomous nonprofit organization Ethno-Cultural Association, LGADA.
Dear representatives of United Nations, indigenous leaders, sisters and brothers. I am representative of the Northeastern Siberian Indigenous Nations, and I acknowledge that we are on the upper land today. Today, I want to raise the attention of the disappearance of our sacred sites due to a fast-paced climate change.
Please cut the mic. Sound engineer, I think we have the wrong person speaking. I've called upon the association, the autonomous nonprofit organization Ethno-Cultural Association, LGADA. will have this resolved. I will continue. I'm going to call upon the Asociación Guardianes del Movimiento Nacional de Abuelas Comadronas de Alachi.
Ricompuché, un gran saludo a la señora presidenta, un gran saludo a todos los hermanos indígenas de todos los pueblos de la tierra. Desde Nim a la Chi, en alianza con las parteras tradicionales indígenas, nosotras, parteras tradicionales e indígenas de las Américas, reunidas en diversidad y fortaleza ancestral, elevamos nuestra voz en el 24 periodo de sesiones del Foro Permanente de las Naciones Unidas para las Cuestiones Indígenas, en abril 2025. Desde nuestros saberes milenarios, defendemos la vida, el buen nacer, el buen vivir. Hoy exigimos visibilizar la partería tradicional, promoverla continentalmente, fortalecer nuestro legado y proteger nuestros sistemas de salud. Somos guardianas de la vida, de los saberes y prácticas ancestrales y unimos nuestra lucha a la defensa del territorio, descolonizando nuestra labor, rechazando sistemas que subordinan nuestros saberes. Demandamos articulación internacional con la OIT, OMS, CEDAW, UNFPA, UNICEF y OPS para posicionar la partería tradicional como pilar de la salud sexual y reproductiva sin discriminación. Exigimos a los Estados miembros la participación de las parteras tradicionales en la construcción del presupuesto para la incidencia en los espacios políticos y organizativos nacionales e internacionales. Exigimos la protección de la transmisión integracional de los saberes ancestrales, asegurando condiciones dignas para la práctica del relevo de la partería tradicional e indígena, el fortalecimiento de nuestros sistemas de enseñanza y conocimientos propios. Defendamos el cumplimiento del Convenio 169 de la OIT y la Declaración de la Organización de Naciones Unidas sobre Pueblos Indígenas en el reconocimiento de la partería tradicional como derecho autónomo. Exigimos rendición de cuentas a los Estados sobre el lineamiento ético contra el despojo de saberes y rutas respetuosas con los sistemas de salud oficiales. Desde el 2004 hasta la fecha, el foro ha hecho 17 recomendaciones sobre partería indígena. Hoy exigimos conocer los avances y que se garantice la participación y construcción conjunta con parteras tradicionales e indígenas en el informe 2026. Instamos a los Estados y a la ONU a eliminar leyes que nos criminalizan. Saludos, Alianza de Parteras.
I thank the representative for their statement. I would like to remind all participants, please do not put your hand up until your organization's name is called, so we don't have any confusion. I'm now going to call upon the representative of Latvia.
Austatud kolēģi, Sazāti Ladies, distinguished colleagues, sisters and brothers, the indigenous people of Latvia, the Livonians, are today a tiny community of fewer than 1,000, with under 20 fluent speakers, including me. We Livonians know very well what war means. In the 13th century, holy war was launched against us by crusaders with the support of the Holy See. In the centuries that followed, under colonization by German, Russian and other powers, we were subjected to assimilation, including by force, and erased from history books, yet we have survived. The world wars of the 20th century turned our last foothold, the Livonian coast, into frontline. Our villages, including mine, were burned and turned into trenches and gun positions. Every single Livonian was deported, yet we returned and worked hard to rebuild our community. But then came the Soviet occupation, which took away our land and way of life forever. Our scene was fenced off with barbed wire. Our people deported and forced from their homes to make space for military. We are now in exile and scattered communities trying to preserve what we have inherited from our ancestors, investing in our children and in the development of digital resources and tools to reclaim what was stolen from us. Our language, our shared space, our daily connections. Together with our homeland, we have been working to heal from the wounds of war and Soviet occupation. From the recognition of Livonian indigenous status in 1991 and the right to show Livonian nationality in documents, something banned under Soviet rule, to more recent actions, building understanding through media, allocating targeted funding, establishing executive research and memory institutions, and introducing state finance, language, and translation for Livonian children last year. Reconciliation and rebuilding communities takes far more time and effort than war. Addressing the consequences and scars that wars and armed conflicts leave on indigenous peoples cost us more than preventing them. And some scars can never be healed. Latvia firmly upholds that Article 30 of the UNDRIP must be unconditionally observed. Whether in Europe, Ukraine, where Russia is waging its colonial war, or in Africa, Asia, or other places. Ensuring peace to indigenous lands and people will undoubtedly be a priority for Latvia on the UN Security Council, and bringing peace and prosperity to indigenous people should be a priority for all of us, as execution of indigenous rights and prosperity of our people cannot be achieved if we are killed, displaced, and oppressed. Diana.
I thank the representative of Latvia for their statement. I now call upon the representative of autonomous non-profit organization, Ethno-Cultural Association, El Yada.
Dear representatives of the United Nations, indigenous leaders, sisters and brothers, I am representative of Northeastern Siberian indigenous nations, and I acknowledge that we are on Napi land today. Today I want to raise the attention of the disappearance of our sacred sites due to a fast-paced climate change. I was born and raised in Yakutia in the Siberian Arctic, where my people led a traditional nomadic lifestyle in what we call the taiga forest and Arctic tundra for thousands of years. But with temperatures in Arctic rising twice as fast as the global average, the environment is changing fast, and it's starting to affect many aspects of our lives. In circumpolar regions, the permafrost is melting, and we are seeing increased flooding and erosion. We've seen huge sinkholes forming as methane and other gases are released from the ground, and out-of-control forest fires are becoming more common. All of this points to a collapsing ecosystem. Animal migration routes are changing, which could mean food insecurity and economic hardship for the hunters like my people. Climate degradation also threatens our culture and spiritual connection to the land, and could potentially harm very important sacred sites, burial grounds, places of worship, rituals, and places for transmission of traditional knowledge. We're also in danger of losing unique knowledge about ecological sustainability and development of our native lands, knowledge about nature and survival in extreme climate, knowledge passed on our countless generations. We must do what we can to preserve and protect indigenous cultural and sacred sites. It's our common responsibility. It's not only about basic respect for our cultures, but also about recognizing these places can inspire future generations and teach harmony with nature and with our fellow humans. We must work together, governments, the scientific community, and we indigenous peoples ourselves. We must stand up to threats and find solutions to preserve the unique heritage of our indigenous lands. I now live in the Northern Territory of Australia, where about 30% of the population are First Nations. And even though the climate is very different to Siberia, I see many similarities in the brutal realities of life and the modern challenges. Around the world, we must recognize the rights of indigenous people to their land, support their ability to practice culture, and actively encourage policies to protect spiritual and cultural heritage. We ask the Secretariat to please consider including the issue of preservation of sacred and cultural sites of all indigenous peoples in the agendas of the upcoming sessions of the Permanent Forum. Thank you very much for your attention.
Nonprofit organization, Ethno-Cultural Association, Eliana. I now call upon the representatives of the United Republic of Tanzania.
Madam Chair, once again, my delegation is obliged to take the floor to clarify an issue of great importance to the Tanzanian, owing the allegations made by participants of this forum on the agenda item 5G. Madam Chair, we continue to reiterate our position that there are no specific category of indigenous peoples in the Republic of Tanzania, as there are more than 120 tribes and ethnic groups, Maasai being one of them. It follows that in the request to achieve national unity, Tanzanians do not identify themselves through ethnic groupings, rather we belong to a nation which is rich in cultural diversity and made up of persons from different backgrounds. The United Republic of Tanzania, the Constitution of the United Republic of Tanzania of 1977 recognizes that all human beings are born free and they are all equal and have equal rights to dignity without any discrimination. Madam Chair, it has been claimed that Maasai are being displaced from their ancestral land. I should inform August Forum that in Tanzania, there are no ancestral or traditional land for a distinct group of people. It is key to understand the land tenure system of Tanzania when discussing Loliondo and Ngorongoro. In Tanzania, land is public and entrusted to the president as a trustee. One is given a right of occupancy for a specific time, as it is not a freehold system. Hence, the allegation that Maasai are being displaced from their traditional land is misplaced. Therefore, there is no history of displacement in Loliondo. In reference to 10 of 2017 filed in the East African Court of Justice, the court dismissed the application for lack of merit, and there was no proof of forceful evictions in the Loliondo game control area. Therefore, we reject all allegations of violence and the forced displacements in Loliondo and Ngorongoro, as well as allegations of coercive measures to compel the residents of the national of NCA to relocate. With regard to the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, NCA, what is taking place is a voluntary relocation program where one is at liberty to apply to relocate. This is an initiative by the government to address environmental degradation as well as the livelihood of the people. It should be noted that due to conservation status of the scene, there was no established in 1979 human activities and developments that are controlled, restricted, and in the other areas prohibited. As the primary objective of the government is the welfare of the people, two commissions were launched on the 20th of February 2025 by President Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of the Republic of Tanzania. One will address land issues in Loliondo, and the other one will address issues in Ngorongoro conservation.
I thank the representatives of the United Republic of Tanzania for their statements. I now call upon the representative of the Indigenous Environmental Network.
Distinguished foreign members and indigenous relatives, I am great-grandmother Mary Lyons of the Anishinaabe Nation. I come before you today on behalf of the Indigenous Environmental Network with the support of indigenous knowledge holders and spiritual authorities. My intervention is to sound the alarm on a new way of biological, environmental, and conservation colonialism and the capitalism of nature, of Mother Earth. We have submitted a research report revealing that carbon markets, red plus schemes, and nature-based solutions consisting of the commodification and the privatization of forests, soils, coastal, and marine ecosystems are being pushed forward by governments, corporations, NGOs, financial institutions, and UN agencies, including Sustainable Development Goals. These are false solutions for mitigating climate change. My relatives, we must say no to these green economy regimes that places a monetary price on nature and creates new derivative markets that will only increase equality, violations on the rights of indigenous people, with increasing the destruction of Mother Earth. We cannot put the future of Mother Earth and humanity in the hands of financial speculation mechanisms and other market systems of conservation of biodiversity offsets and payment for environmental and ecological services. We say no, 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 no. We respectfully urge the forum to request ECOSOC to advance these following actions across the UN system. Number one, declare a permanent moratorium on carbon markets, RED Plus, and geoengineering technologies and practices, particularly those sanctioned under the UNFCCC and UNCBD, due to widespread human rights violations that have no guarantees of effective safeguards. Number two, issue an immediate call to end the expansion of new coal, oil and gas projects and manage a global transition away from fossil fuels. Number three, there is no such thing as sustainable mining. No such thing. We say no to critical mineral extractions on and near indigenous lands and territories. Number four, establish a global database of violations resulting from these false solutions and implement mandatory reporting mechanisms to ensure transparency and accountability to address the grievances. Number five, recognize and uphold indigenous governance systems and indigenous jurisprudence as legitimate binding sources of law and global funding of biodiversity.
I thank the representative of the indigenous on behalf of Nordic countries.
Thank you, Chair. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Denmark, together with Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. For our governments, the promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples continue to be a long-standing commitment. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, together with other international human rights instruments, is a solid ground for our efforts to promote and protect the rights of the indigenous peoples in our countries. Fulfilling the objectives of the Declaration requires consistent work at both national and international level. We support the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination and influence in matters that affect them, as emphasized in the Declaration. Full, meaningful, and effective participation is key for ensuring these rights. Legislation on consultation with the indigenous Sami people is now in force in Finland, Norway, and Sweden. In Sweden, the Sami Consultation Act was extended last year so that not only the government and its agencies, but also municipalities and regions have the obligation to consult the Sami people in matters of particular concern to them. Indigenous peoples continue to play a key role in shaping the 2030 agenda and very often have first-hand experience of the issues the agenda seeks to address. In our shared mission to implement international objectives and agreements such as the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement, the inclusion of indigenous peoples in decision-making processes and continued support for the language, culture and tradition are crucial. Madam Chair, the Nordic governments share a deep concern about continued attacks and acts of violence against indigenous peoples and against indigenous human rights defenders. We strongly condemn all forms of violence, harassments, reprisals, and intimidation, and remain firmly committed to holding perpetrators accountable. We are also committed to combating racism and discrimination, and action plans to combat racism, including directed towards indigenous peoples, are in place in Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. The efforts to combat racism must be comprehensive and continue to be effective, measurable, and long-term. A crucial step to combat discrimination and abuse is to learn from the past. Truth commissions have been initiated in Finland and Sweden and completed in Norway to survey and examine the policies pursued towards the Sami people. In this regard, we welcome the dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice and Reparation initiated
I thank the representative of Sweden on behalf of Nordic countries for his statement. I now call upon the representative of organization Tamaino.
Azul Amghanas Afghan Umadal, honorable delegates. My name is Sana Abidar, the president of AICO, Amazigh Indigenous Cultural and Community Organization. I'm here today to represent Tamaino's organization. We stand before you today to highlight the devastating impact of 2023 earthquake on the Amazigh people in Morocco's High Atlas region. Nearly 500,000 people are without homes, livelihoods, or dignity due to the government's appalling neglect. We demand that the government prioritize the rights and dignity of the Amazigh people and rebuild their homes on their ancestral lands. The government's inaction is not only causing suffering, but also erasing the Amazigh culture and dignity. Land seizure is another major threat striking the Amazigh community on their ancestral lands again. We stress that rebuilding effort must prioritize community-led initiative and in situ reconstruction. The plight of many affected children is particularly dire, with 550 schools damaged or destroyed. We condemn the Moroccan government failure to provide a transparent and community-led reconstruction plan despite collecting international funds. The government's responsibility to ensure the kids' education and well-being is critical. We call upon the Moroccan government to develop an immediate, transparent, and community-led construction plan that prioritizes in situ rebuilding. Protect Amazigh people, cultural heritage, ancestral lands, akal, and right to preserve their traditions and language. Provide urgent support to affected children, including educational and psychological help. We also demand the immediate release of the prisoners of the Reef and the Cruz coordination who are detained for peacefully advocating for their own rights. The international community must hold the Moroccan government accountable for respecting human rights and dignity. We stand firm. Justice and dignity for the Amazigh people must be realized now. The world must act to protect the Amazigh people. تنمية تودات المزيغن أكال في قالوان إمازيغن.
I thank the representative of organization Tamaino for their statement. I now call upon the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, Indigenous people are a peace builder with centuries of wisdom and local values and resilience that offer valuable tools for conflict prevention and mediation. We take note of the study on the impact of colonialization and armed conflict on Indigenous people's rights. When noting the finding, we wish to express our concern on the mentioning of our province, Papua in paragraph 23. Such relevance, if not placed within their full context, may risk conveying an oversimplified portrayal of the relationship between the state and the local communities. In reality, the people of West Papua are an integral part of the broader Indonesian society. The presence of mining operations, for instance, must be within this broader framework of economic cooperation and redistribution. We hope that this forum future studies will consider a wider range of perspectives to strengthen the credibility and relevance of such studies and to help ensure that they contribute constructively to the shared goals of empowering Indigenous communities within the diverse reality of each member state. Madam Chair, on the issues of critical minerals, Indonesia is advancing downstream industry and community empowerment, where the Indonesian people, particularly with other communities, benefit. These are applied throughout Indonesia, including in Papua, by integrating free, prior, and informed consent into regulatory frameworks and enhancing local participation. Therefore, we also regret the reference to Indonesia, particularly to our region of West Papua, in the report of the International Expert Group meeting on the rights of indigenous people in the Chair, my delegation would like to reiterate your call that all participants must respect the mandates of this forum and for not using this forum to promote a narrow political agenda. Therefore, we deeply regret that some participants have again issues this forum to promote their separatism propaganda, which is against the principle of the UN Charter and the respectable forum of UNDIP and the FFII. However, rest assured of our delegation commitment to contribute constructively to this forum. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Indonesia for their statement, and I must reiterate, this meeting space is a space in which we need to be respectful and we need to allow people to complete their statements without interruption. I now call upon the representative of CHT, Indigenous Peoples Council of Canada.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. I am Juby Chakma, speaking on behalf of the CHT Indigenous Peoples Council of Canada. Power is an important factor in obtaining all 6 mandated areas of the permanent forum. As the Indigenous peoples are not the power holders in their respective countries, it depends on the ruling people who are the majority. For a nation to truly thrive, it must recognize that prosperity is built on economic and social development, the preservation of culture, advancements in education and healthcare, and the protection of individual and community rights, including Indigenous peoples. In the Chittagong Hill Tracts, or CHT in Bangladesh, the Juma peoples cannot exercise their power to implement the 6 mandated areas of the permanent forum because of the Bangladesh government's insincerity. In 1997, an agreement took place between the Juma people and the Bangladesh government. The agreement, called the CHT Accord, could be a power sum if implemented with sincerity. 27 years, the accord has not been fully implemented as the government has lacked the sincerity. Sincerity is founded upon trust, compassion, and respect, and the collective pursuit of goodwill within an individual, community, and a nation. Bangladesh is yet to achieve all these qualities. The dictator of Bangladesh fled the country in 2024, and the new interim government, formed with Dr. Mohamed Yunus, who is an internationally well-known economist, could begin to implement the unfulfilled clauses of the accord for a lasting peace and betterment of the country. It has been learned that the Army Chief, General Waker Uzaman, has softened the stance on the CHT issue for democracy, which could indicate his intention for a solution to the CHT. There's a new development for peace in the CHT that the interim government has initiated to implement the CHT Accord by reconstituting the CHT Accord Implementation and Monitoring Committee by Gazette notice on January 12, 2025. However, it is yet to be seen if the interim government is acting with sincerity to implement the remaining provisions of the CHT Accord that will fulfill the aspirations of the Juma people. My request to the Permanent Forum is to please keep on pressing the interim government for full implementation of the Accord, as the Indigenous Juma people are very eager to implement the 6 mandated areas of the Permanent Forum. Thank you.
I thank the representative of CHT, Indigenous Peoples Council of Canada. I now call upon the representative of Estonia. I now call upon the representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In line with the 1997 CHT Peace Accord, Bangladesh has taken initiative to promote inclusive development and to ensure the socio-economic development in the CHT region, particularly in education, agriculture, infrastructure, and livelihood. I'd like to mention a few. Production of quality bamboo is ongoing for livelihood support for the backward communities. Cultivation of coffee and cashew nut is also ongoing as an effort to eradicate poverty in ATA. Significant progress has been made in expanding infrastructure, including the construction of roads, bridges, schools, and healthcare facilities, which have helped mitigate remote areas of improved access to people to essential services. Water supply and sanitation systems have also been upgraded in many parts of the state. To promote education and cultural preservation, primary school textbooks in 5 major languages of ethnic sects or communities are distributed free of cost, and cultural centers and training institutes have been established. Under a dedicated project, 266 new primary schools have been established in KSC, including 4 residential schools, where scholarships to 1,200 students on ethnic sects and minority are studying. In addition, the foundation of primary education is being built by imparting the primary level education to 120,000 children in Bangla, along with their mother tongue, through 24/8 neighborhood centers in 3 hill districts. A part of climate initiative, village common forests and being established, and tree plantation are ongoing across the 3 hill districts. I thank you, Madam.
I thank the representative of Bangladesh for their statement. I now call upon the representative of Clan, Caring and Living as Neighbors Incorporated.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Lenape elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge my ancestors for allowing me to be here today. My name is Janine Giroux. I am the CEO of the Kimberley Aboriginal Women's Council. I am a proud Nigina and Bunba woman from the West Kimberley region of Western Australia. I bring the voices of the grassroots Kimberley Aboriginal women and girls whose voices are excluded from self-determined, aspirational co-design and decision-making. While our cultures are diverse, historically many communities operated under matrilineal systems, tracing descent and inheritance through the mother's line, which is a matriarchal structure, where women hold significant roles in leadership, culture, and knowledge by managing the health of ecosystems and maintaining cultural knowledge and practices. Colonial practices and policies have impacted our traditional systems, including the erosion of women's roles. This impact has left deep scars that still affect our communities today. Today we are faced with overwhelming social challenges. Quite often these challenges fall on the hands and responsibility of our women. 387 children were in care in the Kimberley region of Western Australia last year, the only region in the state where all of these children were of Aboriginal descent. In the past year, family and domestic violence offences have jumped 50%, with an average of 19 incidents being reported every day. Youth crime in the Kimberley has increased by 139% in the last 2 years. Hospital self-harm representations are 10 times that of the international rates. In the 17 years since the Australian government signed the original Closing the Gap Statement of Intent, not a lot has changed. Fast forward to 2025, and the most recent report under the National Closing Agreement on Closing the Gap shows that targets are still not on track. Concerning new data, including an increase in the number of our children held in detention and no reduction in rates of child removal were presented in this year's report. This most recent Closing the Gap report revealed only 5 out of 19 targets are currently on track, emphasising the need for governments to make urgent and sustained changes in their approach to working with our people and our communities. For the sake of our children today, tomorrow and the generations to come, we call on the panel and the international community to recommend to the Australian government as a member state to make a fundamental shift in the way they do business by 1, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in decision-making and co-designing solutions to reform our culture through peace building and nation rebuilding. 2, allowing our communities to lead and make decisions for their own self-determined aspirations.
I thank the representative of the I now call upon the representative of the United States of America.
Thank you, Chair. The United States supports the rights of indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, the rights of certain indigenous populations, including those of Tibetans and Uyghurs in China, are not being respected. The Chinese Communist Party's efforts to erase Tibetan identity, militarize the Himalayas, and co-opt Tibetan Buddhism threatens the human rights of 6 million Tibetans in China and many tens of thousands of Tibetans in diaspora. Additionally, China, under the direction and control of the Chinese Communist Party, has committed genocide and crimes against humanity targeting predominantly Muslims, Uyghurs, and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. The United States urges China to respect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Tibetans, including the ability to express and practice their religion without interference or coercion, and preserve their culture and identity. Likewise, we urge respect for the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Uyghurs, who are subject to so-called re-education, arbitrary detention, torture, sexual violence, forced labor in China. We urge all governments in countries where the Uyghurs seek protection to not forcibly return ethnic Uyghurs to China. We continue to champion the rights and dignities of Uyghurs and Tibetans and stand against the Chinese Communist Party's abuses both at home and abroad. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States of America for their statements. I now call upon the representative of Land is Life.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Mr. Yumnam, belongs to the Meter people. I would like to draw the attention of the permanent firm members to the humanitarian crisis to the ongoing conflict situation in Manipur and the special impact on the indigenous women and children from different communities in Manipur. The conflict situation has led to the urgent need to protect the rights and the lives of the indigenous peoples of Manipur. The pursuance of emergency law has passed, the militarization, it further infringement of indigenous people's rights in our part of the world. I would also like to raise concern regarding the increased creation of conservation areas and also the pursuance of large-scale development process. And in particular, I would like to highlight the creation of the Biosphere Reserve and expansion of the Wildlife Sanctuary under the UNESCO's Man and Biosphere Framework in Tamelong areas in Manipur. And there are also the pursuance of oil exploration along with this declaration. The push for palm oil cultivation in our part, this is again another concern that will undermine environmental impact and the conflict in our part of the world. I would also highlight the impact of the large-scale hydropower project that's been pursued in our region. For example, the Lepcha people of Sikkim, it raised concern that the pursuance of large hydropower projects like the 1,200 megawatt Tisa 3 hydropower project, the 510 megawatt Tisa 5 dam, it already harmed the land, culture, and severed the relationship with the sacred Jonggu and Mom Kanchenjunga. And these are initiatives that will further undermine the realization of the sustainable development goals in our region. In this regard, I would like to forward the following recommendations that I would like to urge the Permanent Forum to recommend the Government of India to protect the lives and the rights of the indigenous peoples of Manipur, to stop targeting innocent indigenous women, children, and infants as targets in conflict, to rehabilitate and resettle urgently the indigenous communities which are affected by the conflict situation in Manipur. And also we urge the government to foster peace building and reconciliation among the different indigenous peoples which are affected by the conflict and urgent basis. And further to also dismantle the creation of buffer zones in Manipur. To further support and implement the recommendations of the UN bodies, human rights bodies, to repeal emergency laws like ASPA 1958 that have prolonged concern in our part of the world. And then of course to reconsider the militarization of the indigenous land. To further urge upon to recognize the rights of indigenous people and also to respect the Lepcha people's call to stop the construction of 520 megawatt Tisa 3 dam in Sikkim. Madam Chair, thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Land is Life for their statement. Distinguished foreign members, distinguished observers, we have exhausted the time available for this meeting. The forum will reconvene in the afternoon stage in this conference room at 3 o'clock. We shall conclude our consideration of item 4, discussion on the mandated areas of the permanent forum, economic and social development, environment, education, health, and human rights, with reference to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. On a personal note, I want to share that 15 members of my family have traveled down from the Arctic to be here with me today, and I just want to welcome them.
Ya, nanti sebentar baru dilanjutkan. Nanti kejadian mungkin Indonesia ada berusaha berjuang mati-matian di depan untuk blokir kita tidak boleh baca statement. Ini sekarang mereka ada maju di depan sana bicara apa lagi. Lihat itu Indonesia dan Papua ada maju ke depan sana menuju ketua. Udah mau lobby ke apa untuk gagalkan lagi. Karena tadi don sendiri bicara kita belum. Jadi kayaknya dia mau berjuang untuk halangi itu. Indonesia perempuan satu yang halangi depan dia mau lobby. Untuk perempuan mana untuk mungkin kita bicara. Ini kepala estafel yang sana. Oh ya, ini ada besar ini. Perempuan dulu. Ini lihat. Lihat ini. Sebelah ini. Besar dan perempuan dulu di Indonesia. Ini buat. Ini mereka lobby untuk menggagalkan kita dari bicara depan lagi. Berulang kali mereka mencoba untuk melarang kita tidak bicara. Minta forum bangunan jangan kasih kita kesempatan untuk bicara.
Hopefully they'll call on us in the afternoon.
Yes.
My whole family was watching the live stream. I was like, I don't know when I'm going to be on.